You're listening to the Fooled by the Root podcast.
Hello, everyone. This is your host, Heidi Marble. I am really thrilled today to have our guest co-host, Amy Hansen, with us. She's helping me do interviews so we can stay on track. Thank you for being here, Amy.
Thank you for having me.
Can you just tell everybody really quick, and they're going to get to know you really fast because we're doing these sequentially, but can you just give them a brief introduction to who you are?
Sure. I'm a domestic adoptee. I was born in 1969, so part of the baby scoop era. I was placed for adoption at birth. I've always known I was adopted, grew up in a loving family, and later in life, in my 50s, kind of came out of the fog, I guess you would say, and realized some of the trauma, or a lot of the trauma, that as adoptees we go through. So I'm in process of trying to navigate this journey.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And Shelise, I practiced saying your name, so we're going to try this. Shelise Keum. Did I do it? I did it. I'm sorry. That's the most excited I've been in a while. Shelise, we're so happy to have you. I have your bio here I would like to read before we get into our conversation. Shelise is the head of operations at Adoption Mosaic. Adoption Mosaic is a BIPOC woman and adoptee-led business that seeks to build an inviting adoption-conscious community by providing innovative adoptee-centered programs and support. She has worked in the adoption community as an editor, educator, administrator for over 10 years, including editing and curating blog Land of Gazillion Adoptees and the online magazine Gazillion Voices. She is also an intercountry Korean interracial adoptee who was adopted as an infant by a white family and raised on a farm in Minnesota. She has 3 siblings who are biological children of her adoptive parents. Shelise has searched but is not in reunion with her Korean family. She lives in Portland, Oregon, and is parenting 2 biological biracial children with her husband. Welcome, Shelise.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, Shelise and I, and Ostrid as well, who founded Adoption Mosaic, we had the most amazing lunch around my old oak dining room table that I've had since I was a child. And I can just tell you that lunch with the 2 of you, it was so grounding and so lovely for me to sit with other adopted people because it's been Zoom. And to be in the presence of 2 such dynamic women who've been doing this work for so long, it was just extraordinary. So I just appreciate you being willing to come on the podcast and to tell your story, Shelise.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for having us. And just so everyone knows, Heidi hosted a marvelous, fantastic, amazing meal for us. So it was,
I do
great.
like to cook, and that's why when I get to feeling better, we're going to have a feast. Yes, we are.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it.
And hopefully wine and all kinds of other things. All right. I wish all of you could come. So Shelise, I was just talking to Amy before we pressed record about just imagining, and I can only imagine because I'm a white domestic adoptee and I felt like I didn't belong, to be in Minnesota on a farm. God love you. I just have to say, I just can't imagine that experience. And I think it's really important for people to understand your history. And if you could take us into your childhood and kind of shape that for us, I think it would help our audience know a little bit more about who you are.
Sure. Well, I think part of what is unique to my family and my experience, or one of the more unique elements, is that my parents have biological children. So I have an older brother, an older sister, and a younger brother. And so I was adopted in the era of assimilation, just treat them like, love them like they were born to you, which was easy for my parents to do because they were already parenting and loving children that were born to them. So I think in that sense, especially in my work and just hearing and knowing a lot of adoptee stories, it made things easier for my parents and for myself because there was very little strings attached to me as an adoptee, me as becoming a member of their family. So what I do know is that my parents, and I'm not sure exactly where, but they just had this idea. I think my mom is, she's the oldest of, let's see, of 5 children. She is just, much like her own mother, just in general, a very maternal person, you know, like a babysitter from a young age, taking care of her brothers and sisters, taking care of other people's kids. And so I think I have, from the other people's stories that I've heard, I think that it made it so much easier for me, because I was a person she was caring for, and that I wasn't a reminder of infertility and the struggles to become pregnant. I wasn't a reminder of, like the inability to have a girl, or and so I think that kind of made the road a lot smoother for us, as far as like feeling included in a part of my family. And I have 3 siblings, and I don't have any recollection of my siblings or anyone, even in my extended family. So I have a really large extended family. I have like 22 cousins on my dad's side, and I don't know, 12 on my mom's side, something like that. And we all kind of grew up in the same area, right? It's a small rural Minnesota community. So often people don't move very far away. So I grew up in this really large family, and I don't ever remember one incidents where somebody said to me explicitly, or even like, Minnesota is very well known for having a very passive aggressive culture there. And I don't have any like concrete memories of someone telling me outright or intimating that I don't belong to my family. Wow. like siblings are like, oh yeah, well, you're adopted. I don't have any memory of having an experience like that, where somebody pointed out that I didn't belong to the family. The one story I do remember is my cousin telling me that somebody else in her class told her that I was adopted. And she was so upset, because she's like, no, she's not adopted. She's just a part of my family. And so I think there's like, there was something about it, like my parents, being able to have biological children, already being parents. I think just my mother's kind of general demeanor, like made that road very smooth, like being a part of my family. And what I know is that they just thought they just wanted to help somebody. They thought they were helping a child in need. They thought they were helping a mother who, wasn't able to care for their child. And so that's, and that was their main motivation.
That is such a unique experience, Shelise, to have. It really is. I didn't know that about you.
Yeah, and I actually didn't know that until, I kind of started in being more immersed and involved in the adoption community, because one of the benefits of my job is that I hear a lot of adoptee narratives, and it helps me kind of put myself in the spectrum and range of experience. And I do really feel like that is a unique part of my experience. And at the same time, there's definitely, of course, like every adoptee has those feelings of not belonging. And I was just explaining to somebody yesterday that I remember writing, like in my journal, I loved to journal when I was in middle school and high school. And I remember writing like, oh, I have a lot of friends, and I'm not alone, but I always feel lonely.
Yeah.
Like that sense of, and I think too, the racial difference was something really hard. And I think we didn't have any, my parents are not racially competent in any way. We come from a small rural community in Minnesota. Most of the people, I would say, are either consciously or subconsciously subscribe to a lot of white supremacist ideas and beliefs. And, as an adult, that's definitely been a lot harder for me to be in that community. But growing up, it was a weird experience in that I was just trying so hard to ignore that part of me. Like I just thought if I didn't think about it, then I could just kind of feel like I was like everyone else. I mean, because, right, culturally, like I knew the foods and the way to talk and all of that, but it's just like, it was like one of those things, like I was wearing the wrong costume. Like if I could just be blonde and have blue eyes, like my sister and my dad, I'm like, oh, I would have it made. Like I would be so popular and everyone would love me. And
that had to be so painful, just to have to disregard that very fundamental part of yourself, even though you were raised in a loving environment. And I think you spoke to the ideas back then about simulating that's the best thing for the child.
Yeah.
And, I think a lot of people are well-intentioned in this, but what ends up happening is all the psychological damage that occurs just because people aren't educated, or they didn't know back in the day that effort would end up actually being hurtful and disregarding of your culture, where you come from. I don't know. Do you have any comments or thoughts, Amy, before I ask Shelise a few more questions?
Sure. I mean, what you said about your mom being maternal, right? And not struggling with that infertility. It's very interesting to me because right now with my adopted mom, we are struggling a little bit with just her understanding the, not fitting in or whatever I'm feeling. And I did bring up the part about infertility, and her comment to me, or her answer was, it didn't matter to me how I made my family. And I was like, that's just such a textbook kind of answer to an adoptee, where I'm like, you're just not addressing that. So it's funny. I mean, not funny, but it's so interesting to hear what a different perspective you had with your mom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder too, Shelise, before we get any further down the line in your story, I want to go back to the very beginning. Can you tell us what you were told about your relinquishment? What is your truth as you know it? Like, what were you told growing up, if anything?
The story that's in my US version of my paperwork is that my Korean mom was unwed, 23, came to the hospital, gave birth, and, asked with tears in her eyes that I be relinquished for adoption. And that was the end. Like, she left the hospital and that was it. I think I was placed in foster care, and I lived with a woman who had adult children, or almost, I think her daughter was maybe like a senior equivalent to senior in high school. She loved babies, and she just took care of me until I was adopted. And then, they literally just put me on a plane and flew me from Seoul to Minneapolis. And my parents, it was my mom and dad, my mom's mom, my grandma, and my older brother and sister came to the airport to pick me up.
Well, and how old were you?
So I was about 9 months old.
Oh, wow, Shelise. So you had a history there. That's incredible. Yeah, and I want to circle back because I think when I was reading more about you that you did go back to Korea.
I did,
so
yeah.
I want to talk to you about that more. But before we do that, let's talk about, so you're a teenager now, you're starting to understand that you are racially different and unique. And when did you realize, not the disconnect, but when did you realize how adoption was affecting you? And when did all of that start to unfold for you?
Not until I was probably in my mid-20s. I was about to get married. Mm-hmm. Surprise, surprise, right? Major life change, shaking things up. And until then, I think because I did feel very secure in my place in my family, part of it of how my family treated me, but part of it is like I felt like I put in a lot of effort to to have a place in my family. And I, at that time I was feeling pretty good about it and just like, kind of that same like, oh, I'm well adjusted. I love my family. I don't need to find my Korean family because I have a family that loves me already. But at the same time, on the other side of my brain is like, whoa, what if I'm what if I'm the daughter of somebody famous or a princess or, whatever. And I don't know if I have a copy of it anymore, but I had an essay that I wrote. A friend of mine, fellow Korean adoptee who I met at Minnesota Farmers Union Camp. He was working at an adoption agency and he was making a collection of essays by adoptees. So I wrote this piece that was like, the first half was all about how I'm happy in my family and so content and I don't need to find anyone. And the second half is all about like, but what if I did? Who are these people? Like, and without even realizing like that is something that I wanted to pursue. And I just, so, and, fast forward a few years later, I'm going to get married and it was really like one of those epiphany moments where I was sitting with my husband and we were just talking and like, we were kind of like playing around and teasing each other. And I don't know what happened, but something just kind of snapped and I just started crying. And I'm not a crier by nature, like that doesn't come easy to me. And I was just like sobbing. And later on, I was like, I think I just might have some issues. Just a few. Like, I think I might have some stuff that I need to process. And also, I think some of it is my mind was sort of subconsciously in that space. My husband himself was involved in like a period of like heavy therapy and self-reflection. And and I think it just kind of the seed was planted and like, oh, maybe this might be a good time to self-reflect myself, even though outwardly I was very resistant to that idea. And I think part of it was because deep down I knew there was a lot going on, and to open that can of worms, so to speak, it would be a lot. And so I didn't want to do it, but then I did. I started seeing a therapist and just kind of going down this road. That's also when I found Adoption Mosaic. Actually, a coworker of my husband's, who is herself an adoptive mom, was like, oh, Shelise should meet Ostrich. She runs this organization called Adoption Mosaic and wasn't working at the time. So I started volunteering there and it was like amazing. Like Ostrich blew my mind. Like I had never heard anyone talk about adoption like she did.
I know, she's incredible.
Yeah. And just like, I feel so, and as an adoptee, I don't say this lightly. I feel so grateful to have come into the beginning of my adoption identity journey, knowing Ostrich and having her as a guide and a mentor, because I feel like it made it just such a safe, kind, loving space. But with a lot of freedom to think what I wanted to think and feel what I wanted to feel, she's not directive or, it doesn't have to, you don't have to think like her for her to be in community with you. And for me, that was just such a perfect kind of situation to be in. And and I think that's when I really started to, so I was maybe 26, 27, like really thinking about, oh yeah, I grew up as a non-white person in a very white space, and that impacted me.
Yes.
And I think part of it too is like, you don't, as a interracial adoptee, you don't always want to admit that, because then it kind of, what does that mean for your whole life, that you thought this, you kind of reflect on it as this package, and then all of a sudden you're shining a new light on it and you're showing all these like cracks and fissures, and you're like, I don't want to see that. Like what I thought I had was really good and easy and safe. And now I'm just like shaking it up and making it look all different. And it's a lot harder. But in the long run, for me, it's been a lot better because I don't get to live in as, kind of in the, some people say under the umbrella of white privilege or proximity to white privilege, but I don't get to live in the cove of my parents' community anymore. I live as an independent woman of color on my own, so which I think if you don't realize that as an adoptee and an adult adoptee, if you don't realize that, if you're still very much under the guidance of, white supremacy and general racism, that could become very harmful to you, especially in this day and age. If you don't realize that you are perceived as other, you could unknowingly put yourself in very dangerous situations.
Well, I didn't even think about that being, yeah, that's a huge and important point to make. It's not just about your inner life, it's about your external life, how you exist in the world. And it's just powerful that you've made all these revelations, and it's so amazing that Ostrid was there to walk with you, because so many of us go through this journey without that kind of support.
Yes.
And are stepping on these landmines, and it can, like you said, it's just that shaking everything up and all the pieces are on the ground and you're trying to pick them all up and put it together. Amy, is there any thing you can relate to here, or questions you have for Shelise about these issues we just talked about?
Yes, I mean, it is. It's one of those things that I feel the same, that I had a very happy childhood. Growing up, even my husband was like, you never wanted to search. You never wanted to know. You always said you were, a happy adoptee. I have a sister-in-law who has adopted 3 children, and 2 are interracial. And when she asked me, years ago, how I felt about adoption, I told her what an amazing thing it was, and that how grateful I was, how lucky I was. And, take that ahead 20 years, and she now knows I'm struggling with some things. And she's like, but you always said it was great. But that's how I felt before, until the craziness went inside me of all these but I feel this way deep inside that I've never shown anyone, but it's coming to a surface, and I felt like I can't push it down, because that's just not being true to myself. It's not letting who I really want to be out. So, where that hits us all different times. Like you had that change of life. I think mine was my kids were older and leaving the home, and it was maybe I could focus more on myself rather than the children. But yes, that is incredible. And, I do have 2, a niece and a nephew, who are now 18 and 20, my nephew has reached out to me, who struggles a bit, and had told me the kind of things like, when he was running track, where's your mom? That's my mom. They're like, that's not your mom. He's Asian and she's blonde hair, blue eyes. And I can't imagine going through life where people are always questioning, how are you telling me that's your mom, or that's your dad, or that's your cousin? Like my girls went to the same high school. They're like, that's not your cousin. They're like, yes, that's my cousin. And it's just, you keep those all inside. And it's amazing that you share this, because I think that just helps so many people understand.
Yeah. And I think one of the greatest injustices to the adoptee community is that no one tells us from the beginning that it can be both. And you can love your family and feel happy, and you can feel sad and lonely and frustrated. But I think society in general demands only one thing of us, and that's gratitude.
Oh my gosh.
Right.
Drum roll.
Right. And and I think part of whatever you call it, coming to consciousness, coming out of the fog, is your realization that it's you can't just do one thing anymore. It's impossible. It's so hard. And it's very damaging to the very essence of who you are, to not allow the fullness of what you feel and think and want to be present all the time.
Well, Shelise, that just hits home so deeply, because I think so many people, the guilt, I need to be grateful. How dare I want more? But it's a human right.
Yeah.
It really is, I love how you put that, because it is about and. It's
Mhm.
about both. It can't just be one thing and one
Yeah,
thing.
and that's one of the most valuable things I've learned knowing Ostrich and being in the Adoption Mosaic community is it's the both and. Like, you can have all those positive feelings and all of what people would label as negative feelings, but they're just real.
And I'd love to speak now just a little bit about Adoption Mosaic, because you mentioned it. One of the things that I am so obsessed with and so in love with your organization is I feel like there is no topic that's off limits. You guys look at every single angle of this. You invite everybody into the conversation. It is so respectful. I really think that's where the healing and the understanding, and we can redefine what all of this means for people, and educating those that are adopting, those that have been adopted, and getting all these experts together and hearing all of these voices. I would love to know, Shelise, just on your own healing journey, and you've already talked about this, what it's meant to be with Ostrich, but what else has it done for your soul? Like, to do this kind of work. Have you ever had times when it's been really hard? Because I know sometimes after a podcast, I'll be so deeply affected. And we talked about being well processed, and I'm like, I just want to be like the ham in that aisle that's like so processed. It's never going anywhere. But I don't think I'm that processed yet. So all humor aside, I'd just be interested to know kind of your internal journey with this and doing this kind of work.
I think at the beginning, I was very much still processing, trying to understand my own feelings, try to place myself, in the community. And so a lot of what motivated me to be involved in Adoption Mosaic and involved in the adoptee community is kind of whatever it was I was doing was helping me understand myself more, and while also kind of giving me the satisfaction of helping and working with others. And so, and at that time, it was a little more like self-centered, I think. Like, I was a lot more easily activated by like something I read on Facebook, or, some op-ed. I remember Ostrich and I went to see Scott Simon. He's like an announcer on NPR.
Oh, yeah.
And he is an adoptive father. He has, I think, two. I don't remember if they're twins, but I think he has some girls, he and his wife adopted from China. And he wrote a book about it. I remember going to hear him talk. And, it was very, of course, adoptive parent centered. It was about their journey with very little consideration of all the things that adoptees want adoptive parents to consider when they're thinking about, one, sharing their children's story, and two, preparing to parent them in all stages of their life, not just when they're cute babies and you're so excited for them to be a part of your family. There's just so much more. I think one of the greatest injustices to adoptive parents is that they don't tell you that you have to play the long game, and you better be prepared at the front end for the long game. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard to catch up. And Amy, you mentioning your mom struggling with some things now is, I think, absolutely illustrative of that, right? Like, if you don't know that these are milestones or road bumps that you might come across in the future, and you're not prepared, then it sounds a bit dramatic, but it's true, because I see it at Adoption Mosaic. Your family could fall apart. You could not have a family. You could not have a daughter or son anymore. You could not have parents anymore, because nobody has the tools and no one had the knowledge going forward of like, this is something I need to get ready for.
Right.
And that's the tragedy that's played over and over again. And I experienced in my own life with my own adoptive mother, losing her while she was still alive. Is still one of the most painful things I've ever dealt with.
For me, it's like to lose a parent again, and to lose them without them being able to acknowledge your full self. I feel like is such a pain that it would be really hard to manage that for the long term.
Yeah, you got me there, Shelise.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. And I mean, I feel like I'm in these days, I'm like less activated by things, and still there's just absolutely times where, some stories are just so heartbreaking, or you just really identify with somebody. Astrid and I have recently started doing some work with the state of Colorado, working in their child protective services, or DHS system, and it's hard to see people. It's just hard to witness the process of removal for whatever reason, because I think as adoptees, we know no matter what the reason, the consequences of losing your parents is, no matter what, however somebody measures their quality or fitness, it's hard. And I think I found that too, like not too long after I got involved with Adoption Mosaic, I went through the training to be a guardian ad litem. In Oregon, they're called CASAs, court appointed special whatever. And it was like me, one other woman of color, and then like 35 middle-aged white ladies. And the training was very much, it's very trauma focused, but in a way that isn't like, to me, it wasn't about how to understand and empathize or guide somebody through trauma. It was about how to pathologize kids because of what you think they suffered. And I was like, there's so much. And I went through the process. There was only one session out of like, I don't know, maybe it was 30 or 40 hours about race. And of course, in a lot of child protective systems, children of color far outnumber white children. And here are a bunch of white people like getting ready to tell judges about how fit or good or whatever the parents are. And I had like one case, and I quit because it was like one of those things where it's like, I can't be the person to say, like, even have an opinion, like where my opinion might change somebody's mind about whether kids should be with their parents or not.
Oh, yeah, I can't imagine that kind of pressure. And it's also very scary to think about innocent kids being in the hands of people who obviously are well-intentioned, but they don't have the reference point to be able to make the best decisions on their behalf. And so everything just gets so messy so fast.
Yeah. And I think it's so easy to overlook that pain of separation.
It is, because it's like, well, you'll be better off than you are. And
yeah, and that more resources and the idea of better off so easily outweighs not being with your people.
Well, I'm so glad that you chose to walk away from something that didn't feel right for you, because I think a lot of times the pleaser in us will stay too long.
Totally. I had a lot of guilt about it, for sure.
Yeah,
but it didn't feel right. And it is and I think part of it is understanding at that time, understanding myself better as an adoptee, and kind of knowing like where my boundary was, is like, I'm not somebody who can participate in any shape or way with removal and separation and termination. Like, that's not something I can do. And I just think, and now I think I was involved in Adoption Mosaic. I was involved in, some blogs and some magazines and being in the community. And then I just took like a hard break. I had a baby, and I just knew it, like, emotionally, I wasn't going to be able to fill both buckets to myself.
But that's so good, because I think, I don't know, Amy, how you feel about this, but I don't see the red flags waving at me, stop, slow down, quit, until there's a crisis. And I think it's so wonderful that at your age that you are realizing and that you processed enough and healed enough that you can say, okay, I know this is my bandwidth for this. This is my capacity. Because a lot of times I think there's so much disconnection with adopted people in their own heart and soul and mind that they just, everything just doesn't line up. You know, speaking about somebody else, of course. But
and I also have to say, like, as a new mom, and the thought of leaving my baby with someone I didn't know was, I couldn't even imagine it. And I never thought that I would be like that mom, like never left their kids, but I'm absolutely that mom. Like the thought of my kids, like just leaving them somewhere or having them be away for a long time is like, I know that's my own thing. But it totally influences how I feel about them being gone, or, you know, being with other people. And I couldn't do it.
No,
Like,
that's real. That's really real. Amy, can you relate? I mean, you seem more even killed than I am, but do you like?
Oh, I was the same way with my kids, especially my oldest. When he was born, you know, everyone wants to come over and see your baby. And I'm just like, I don't want to let anyone hold my baby. You can come look at him. But I did. I stayed at home with my kids, and, you know, we rarely left them with anyone, maybe family. But yeah, it was one of those things. I never wanted to let them go away and be with someone else. I really held them close.
which I totally thought was my own thing until at Adoption Mosaic, we had a We the Experts ally panel. It was adult children of adoptees. So kids whose parents are adopted people. And someone, I think it was actually Ostrich daughter who was on the panel, Maya, she mentioned about how she really didn't have babysitters. And then the chat just blew up of all these adoptees who were like, yeah, no, I never had a babysitter for my kid. I was like, oh, good. I don't feel so bad now. Like, I don't feel like some crazy, like weird mama bear, like who can't stand to be away from her children. But I think it's just like a really common feeling.
Well, we don't want our kids to feel, I think the essence of it, when I look back on my own parenting, I think a lot of it was fear-based. I never wanted my son to feel abandoned. So I wasn't a helicopter mom. I was like a Black Hawk helicopter mom. You know, you can just see I'm coming. And it's been really interesting because as of late, he's 25 now, we've been able to have some very real conversations about what that was like for him. And it's actually so painful for me to hear it because I can't go back. I can't change it, but at least giving him the opportunity to speak about it. And I think that's another reason what the work that you do is so powerful, because as adopted people, our plight doesn't affect us. It affects everybody that we love. And what are we passing on if we don't do our own work and our own healing? What does that look like for our own children? And so I think that there's just so much to unpack and to discover about, I don't know, best practices going forward.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of adoptees definitely start down the road of exploring their adoption experience and identity when they do have kids, because all of a sudden they're wondering, like, what do I have to offer my kids? You know, what am I going to tell them about who they are and who they're from? And, you know, I definitely had struggles about thinking about how my kids are genetically related to my husband's parents and not mine.
Right.
And that was hard. Like it's still sometimes hard for me, and not like it was nefarious or anything, but that's just something people with birth privilege have. They have that connection, that biological genetic connection. And it's hard to explain to people what it's like when you don't have that.
It's very, very hard to explain. And one thing, I just want a little diversion, Shelise, because I want to get back to, because you have such beautiful advice for people, but I want to get back to your story just a little bit, as far as, you know, you haven't had the opportunity to connect with your original family. How is that setting with you? What does it feel like for you? What do you want for your own healing? What more needs to take place? I'm just curious where you're at on your trajectory, because you clearly are you've made a lot of beautiful progress, but it sounds like there's some undone.
Yeah, well, what I want is for my Korean family to have immigrated to maybe the US, like somewhere in Southern California or, Vancouver, BC, even, like
nice.
that they know
Pretty.
English, that they live close by, and that's if I could choose what I could have right now, that's what I would want. But I think and Ostrich and I have recently had a series of conversations about this, and that is one of the reasons that I think it is so important that adoptees be in community with other adoptees and know the range of adoptee experiences, is that while it is hard not to know my Korean family, I also see that I don't have to navigate a really difficult relationship. No matter how healing or beautiful it is, it's hard. And then you throw in the element of language and culture, and it's very difficult. I mean, Astrid has been in reunion with her mom for over 10 years, and it's still can be a hard relationship. And so and now in this point in my life, I can have some gratitude for not having to deal with that. Like it takes up space and energy to maintain an overseas relationship with people that maybe you don't speak the language. I have tried to learn Korean on several occasions, and I know some like words and phrases, but I haven't tried hard enough to become fluent to any degree. And but it is hard, and especially with kids, in that this whole idea of legacy and also just not knowing your own family history. I like epigenetics and intergenerational trauma really freaks me out.
Oh yeah.
It's like, I'm like, oh no, like I'm like, here, I thought I just had to deal with my own thing.
Nope.
And I'm just unknowingly and unwillingly passing it on to my kids. And like, there are some times where I was like, with my oldest, just how she is emotionally, sometimes I'm like, oh, is that because of me?
Right. I know. It's a thing.
Oh no. But yeah, and I think just not knowing that, and there's been some studies about ambiguous loss, and then some studies connecting the adoptee experience and ambiguous loss. And I think it's just like, it's so hard to articulate what it is to not have that, the absence of that, especially to people with birth privilege. It's so hard to explain. Because
can you define ambiguous loss for people that may not understand the terminology?
Yeah, it's kind of just like like an unexplainable feeling of loss. Like, it isn't about something specific. It's like, maybe you could say you lost, having feelings of loss for your mother, but it's like, you don't know what she looks like. You've never talked to her. You don't even know if she's alive. And so, you just don't know, but that feeling of longing and desire and wanting for people. I mean, I think even sometimes it can just be for a place, for your birth country, like wanting to feel a part of that. Because I think there is it may not be genetic, but I think it's a part of a very, strong, like subconscious collective idea about place. I mean, I see it in my own family, like such a large family, even among my cousins, not very many of us have moved. And it's just culturally, it's so acceptable to like live in the same town that you grew up in. And it's weird if you don't. And it's very enmeshed, and for better, for worse. But I think part of it is like, my 3 siblings, they all still live in or near my hometown, our hometown. And I think some of it is just like this collective idea about place and home and where you belong. And I think you can have a lot of longing for a place, even if you don't know it well. Because when I went to Korea in 2011, and I do remember getting off the plane, and like I describe it as like feeling I mean, I had a lot of anxiety about the trip. I remember having this moment of getting off the plane and going outside, and I felt like my bones settled. Like I was I was in the place I was born, like connected to the land and all of the people before me without knowing who they were, but I could feel it. And I just know there's power in place.
I relate so deeply to that because when I drove into the state where I was born, my body knew. And it's just so fascinating when you think about ambiguous loss. To me, that is such a profound loss because you can't shape it into any form. It's just so big and so wide. Where if you have an individual that you've lost, then you know that's contained in that relationship. So thank you for explaining in that way. That was just really powerful. So Shelise, there are a lot of amazing people in our audience listening, and they're hurting, and they're in reunion, and they're not in reunion. And what can you tell, I guess, the triad or whatever, however you want to state it, what's important as far as messaging to all of the people that, I know this is a really big question, but if we could break it down to adopted people, if you could speak to them, if you could speak to people that are relinquishing and maybe people that are considering adoption. I just think you have such a broad spectrum of knowledge that any wisdom you can impart to those groups would be lovely.
I think it is one of the challenges is that we come into this experience so isolated from one another. As adoptees, even, in the adoptee community, as domestic same race, as in, transracial, interracial, as, and late discoveries. And sometimes it's, part of it, especially I feel like among adoptees, is like you have waited so long to find your people, and then you finally find people that you identify with. It's hard to let that go and broaden that, or remember that we need all perspectives. We need people who, say they're happy adoptees. We need people to say abolish everything that, adoption has to do with. And we need to have that range of opinions, because it just, being able to be united and yet firm in our individual experiences shows that we're not, adoptees aren't a monolith, and there isn't one experience or outcome from adoption. Not everyone is just happy. Not everyone is just angry. There's a whole range. And sometimes you're on one side of the range, and sometimes then you're on the other. And that's okay, because it's an experience that ebbs and flows. And I think, for like people who are social workers and adoption professionals and participating in removal and placement, you have to remember that it has consequences, and they're not all just good. And your responsibility to this person is not just to say you live with a family that has more money now. It's to say you live with a family that has more money, and they have committed to that money to tools and resources to help you understand your experience and be accountable for their own participation in your hurt. Because I think that's also hard especially for adoptive parents. I would say, even Heidi, as a parent of somebody that isn't adopted, right? Like, you have to be willing to be open and accountable for the experience of your adopted person. You have to be able to say, you know what, I hear you. I can't change it, but I hear you. I'm willing to hear you. I'm open to hear you. I'm willing to sit with you in this, because I think really that's all we want. I think partly because of being in the role of parent, we're expecting parents to change it or make it different. And also to be able to hear it and know that I'm not asking for it to be undone. I'm just asking you to acknowledge the things that have been done. Things that I might have noticed until now, but they were done. And to say, you know what, I hear you. I understand that. I wish I could change it, but I can't. I mean, if you're in reunion forever, if you're in an open adoption, it doesn't change the fact that we are adopted, and there are consequences and feelings and ideas that come with that experience that will never be undone. It's never an undone thing. And I think the more we can understand that and go forward with that understanding, the more we can be together. Because we say adoption, but it's not one thing, it's many things. It's many people who need to understand other people. Adoptive parents need to understand adoptees. Adoptees need to understand adoptive parents and give them some grace and understanding as well. And birth parents as well, right? They really need to understand what the person they relinquished might have went through or might have felt about them or about being relinquished in general. And that there's just so many places where we need to understand each other that we haven't had enough opportunities to come together.
That was just so beautifully said. I really agree with you, because when you do finally find community and then there's division and fussing within that community, it's just more loss.
Mm-hmm.
I love the way that you fleshed that out and made sense of that. And that is really where my heart is too. It's like we just need to have a giant, long, worldwide table where we sit and say, listen, we have this common experience, but inside of that, we each have our own individuality. And can we just respect each other and unite and do something good in the world?
Yeah.
Shelise, this has been an incredible interview. Amy, are there any last things you wanted to say to Shelise?
No, I love what you said at the end about just, we are all so different, but yet we do have this common, adoption. And that if we can just respect and listen and hear each other, everybody who's involved in adoption will just make such a big difference in everyone's world and the way we communicate together. It's so important to just listen and, don't argue about it. Just understand things come with consequences, right? Good and bad. Mm-hmm. It's not to say that an experience for one person is worse than the other.
No, definitely not. Shelise, is there anything that you wanted to talk about today that we didn't get to? Any last words or ideas or thoughts before we wrap up here?
Well, I did want to say, and Amy, you definitely have got my wheels turning about this. I mean, part of what we do at Adoption Mosaic is we do have education for adoptive parents, because we do feel like it shouldn't be your responsibility to educate or fill in your mom about all these things that she might have missed or be missing about your experience and how she can be supportive to you in that experience. And so we try really hard. One, we have a course that's 12 weeks long, and that's kind of the long game course. Like, you might be at the beginning stages of the process, but we're going to tell you all of the things you need to anticipate and give you some tools and ideas for about that in the future. And then we do also have a course for, we call it seasoned parents. It's Astrid and an adoptive mother is, they're the facilitators. And it's for adoptive parents with adult children who need to or want to understand more about adoption and what their adult adoptee might be experiencing, and also a place for them to have community, like to know that they're not, I think a lot of times when your adoptee starts having issues, like you feel like you failed as your parents can perceive it as a failure on their part, when it's like, oh, it's like we've all been kind of shortchanged in this experience. And we all deserve to know other people who are experiencing something similar or part of something similar. And I think it makes for better families when, your parents can have their own people to say their own things and process their own things. And then you can come together and be easier somehow, like where all those hard conversations, it's just not the two of you. Somebody else is having a hard conversation for you. So, and I think that's important. And it's like, when we're talking about support and resources, is realizing also, especially for adoptees, that you don't have to be the only person educating and informing your family. There's communities of people who who do that for a living. So it's just about finding them and knowing that they exist.
Yeah, and that's a really powerful and important point, because I think we always think we have to fix it all.
Yeah,
And-
right. Everything in isolation, like you grow up the only adopted person or never talking about adoption. And then now that you want to talk about it, you're the only person to talk about it. And it's better to have your people in your community hold up other parts of your community.
Yeah, so beautifully said, Shelise. I thank both of you ladies. This has been an incredible hour with you. I feel like I've learned so much. And
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
I want to talk to you again, Shelise, and certainly want to see you again in person. And Amy, I wish you didn't live so far. You could come. I mean, that would be quite a trek. But well, thank you, ladies, so much. And Shelise, continue to do the amazing work you are in the world. And
Same to you. Thank you.
it's just inspiring for me to be connected to such strong and amazing women like the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you.